All right, Breea. So what is a neurodiversity affirming assessment?
So a neurodiversity affirming assessment actually starts with the lens of being a neurodiversity affirming provider. And
Mm.
what that means really is that the provider understands that neurodiversity is a totally normal part of human diversity, and that it's something to be embraced and accepted and supported. And so through that lens, we can conduct assessments that really speak to who the individual is, their strengths, the beautiful things about their brains, and also the things that we can do best to support them. Neurodiversity affirming really means that we accept a child for who they are, that their brain is valid, even though it's different. That's completely acceptable, and we value their unique strengths and their unique support needs. And we're not trying to change them to make them fit into the neurotypical world. We just accept them for who they are. And again, really focus on how we can support them best.
And how, if we're talking specifically about an IEP
Mhm.
assessment, so how would this differ from a typical school assessment that we might see?
So the difference between a traditional evaluation, school-based evaluation, and a neurodiversity affirming evaluation for an IEP is really the lens that it's taking. So you'll see things like referencing, rather than saying that a child has deficits in areas, you might see things like differences in certain areas. You'll see things that really highlight how the student works and learns best, how the student stays regulated, rather than focusing, what we traditionally focus on is the behaviors that we're seeing or when students aren't doing well. A neurodiversity affirming assessment and IEP is really going to highlight the things that the child can do well and the things that support the child when they need that extra additional support to do well.
And so we talk a lot about strength-based IEPs,
Mhm.
strength-based assessments. So is that the same? Are we talking about the same thing, or is it just different language for the same approach, or are those two separate concepts?
So the strengths-based and neurodiversity affirming, they do have a lot of overlap.
Mhm.
Conceptually, they're similar. Lots of, the neurodiversity affirming movement really focuses on strengths as well. Um, but the neurodiversity affirming movement really is its own kind of culture, the neurodiversity culture. And there are lots of different tenets that go into it and different components, different approaches that are taken, and specific views. So there is a difference there. I also think the strengths-based approach is lovely, and I absolutely, think it's super important. But the neurodiversity affirming approach also recognizes a little bit more that people have disabilities that are very disabling for them, and just really focuses is not even a disability being a strength, but just being a neutral, normal part of the human variation.
What's important for us to know is that I mean, we all want it in the same bucket. We all want this as
Yeah.
part of like what we're doing and what is being normalized and part of the process in a way that should be normal in what we're doing, not the outlier, right? This should be the standard. But why, I guess this is asking the really obvious question, why is this important? Like, what do you see when you're working in the field? Is this something that you're seeing frequently? And why is this important that we need to bring this more into the mainstream?
It is very important. It's important to think about the messaging that people with disabilities, and especially children with disabilities, receive, and how we can reframe that messaging so that they don't feel shamed or guilty or bad about their disabilities, because there's absolutely nothing wrong with having a disability, with being neurodivergent. And so it's really important that, especially in the lens of assessment, thinking about when they read this in 10 years, what are they going to think about themselves? What will they think about the people working with them? It's really important that we frame things in a way that focuses on, again, their unique strengths and what can be done to help them better, rather than focusing on how often they were non-compliant or how often they engaged in aggressive behaviors, but rather what we can do to support them so that they can stay regulated throughout the school day, so they can self-advocate for themselves. So it's really important to think about how the kids will perceive themselves, but our evaluations are extremely important for how teams perceive them as well. Another reason why is because the neurodivergent community is telling us that they want this. People with lived experiences should have a big voice in how other people are treating them. And so that's another really important thing for me is the neurodiversity community wants this. They're asking for this. They're begging for it, that we change our lens to be affirming. And that's really important. So we have to change our practices to make sure that everyone feels heard and included.
I would love to hear, one or more examples of something that we would hear, a scenario from an average IEP assessment versus something that we would hear from a neurodiverse affirmative assessment.
In a traditional IEP, you might see a child has deficits in social emotional reciprocity. But in a neurodiversity affirming IEP, you'll see something like the child has differences in how they communicate, and their social interactions might look different than someone who's neurotypical. So just those changes in wording really help shift the lens of everyone interacting with them.
With that shift, what changes have you seen with teams when they are reading and reacting to a neurodiverse affirming assessment? I mean, how do you see the programs that they're creating, the supports they're creating for those students? How does that look different?
It looks a lot different because we look the report is the base of the IEP. Everything starts with that report, that assessment report. All the goals come directly from that assessment report. So then those goals become neurodiversity affirming. They focus on things like regulation. They focus on things like self-advocacy. They focus on what the child wants because child's voice is really important in the evaluation process as well for a neurodiversity affirming report. So that's one part. The goals are going to be better. Maybe I'm biased, but the goals are going to be better and the accommodations are going to be better. They just will. Because when you're a neurodiversity affirming provider, you're you're going into the classroom and you're looking at what things are supporting this child right now and what things are not working. So you can really make a really solid IEP because you understand, oh, this kid's you're not just looking at this kid's moving around a lot. You're looking at, this kid likes to stand while they're working. That's an accommodation we're going to put in their IEP. So just those types of things, they are fiddling with things in on their desk. Great, let's get them some fidget tools. That's a great accommodation for their IEP. So just things like that that are so important because again, it all starts with the evaluation. So if your evaluation is super behavioral based, super medical model, that's that's what your IEP is going to look like too. We also don't just look, obviously at behaviors. We're also looking at cognitive skills, right? Where are their strengths there? How can those be highlighted? And those areas of weaknesses, how can they be supported? In what ways do they learn best? So it's behavior is definitely a big part of it than the social emotional piece, but it really is all around how can we support kids, their academic skills the same way. Maybe on standardized testing, they don't do very well, but they do really well when they're given manipulatives. Or if I add music to, something that they're doing, maybe they like matching letters to a music video, right? If it's the letter T, great, they can match letters, but on a standardized test, they don't do that. And that's because their brain doesn't work that way. And that's okay. That doesn't mean that they don't know letters. It just means that the way that they show what they know looks different. So it's really important too that the academic testing, any standardized testing, the cognitive testing is also paired with solid observations that show when the child is being successful and what specific things they need in order to show what they know.
how would parents request this kind of assessment for their child? Because I can see a lot of districts kind of saying like, what are you talking about? Or like, this is what we already do that. We already do that. Of course, we already talk about the strengths, and not in a malicious way, not in a, but really like we're already doing that way. How can families ensure that this is happening in their child's IEP?
So, if a family is seeking a neurodiversity affirming assessment, I think it's really important to keep in mind that some of your providers have been practicing the way that they've been practicing for a really long time. And it doesn't mean that they're not skilled providers just because they aren't doing neurodiversity affirming assessments. But you can definitely start broaching it with your teams by talking about how your family views your child, right? So if you view your child through that neurodiversity affirming lens, that's amazing. Talk about that in an IEP. Have a parent letter before the IEP that talks about the neurodiversity affirming lens that you use with your child. Not a lot of people know what the neurodiversity affirming movement is. So even if you just say, well, I want a neurodiversity affirming assessment, like the special ed director is probably going to be like, what are you talking about? I don't know what that means, right? So honestly, a big part of it might be educating them about what it is in the first place. And then um, sometimes as parents, we have to share the resources that we know too. So just sharing as many resources as we can with them to start kind of putting that lens on. And then if you have an advocate or a consultant that you work with, um, inviting them in to help reframe some of the IEP or the accommodations, the goals to be more affirming can be really helpful. And especially when, it's your child, it's your baby. So you want to make sure that the IEP really feels authentic, and it can be helpful to have another person there to help with the reframe for teams.
There's one thing about like reading the assessment and writing this in a way that's neurodiverse affirming, but what about actually conducting that assessment in the
Mhm.
same way?
Yeah.
And so how do we approach the assessment team before it's happening to see if that approach can be used, and what does that look like actually in the moment with the child?
Yeah, so working with kids to conduct a neurodiversity affirming assessment is really important. And that is the first part of the assessment process. Sometimes it's even basic things like, what does your office look like? Has my kid ever been there before? It's a new place. That might not be very comfortable for them to just come right in the fluorescent lights of your office and start testing. So it's even things like, you know, bringing up like, hey, my child has some or does best when we can kind of preview the setting beforehand. So is it okay if they, do a walkthrough of your office first? But even like for the assessor, making sure that we have sensory items that we, if a kid is laying on the floor, get on the floor with them and present the test items. We don't need to use token boards to get kids to comply. If they can't show what they know in a traditional way, that's okay. Stop the assessment, take a break, play a game, discontinue it altogether, and just say, you know what, we're not going to do this. We're going to do a non traditional assessment. And I think, as a provider, sometimes we're a little afraid to do that because we're worried about what parents might think if we don't get the score or if we don't get the assessment done. Are they going to think that I'm not a good psychologist? So sometimes even just sharing as a parent, sharing with them that that's not a priority for you, that you really want to be able to get at what the kid is able to do and what supports can be helpful for them. But getting a standardized score isn't the most important thing. If that applies for your situation, then that's great. But yeah, just making sure that the kid feels really welcome and the assessment process feels easy, not easy, but not as harmful, I guess.
Right.
Not as aversive. That's what I was thinking.
And
And
not only about compliance.
not only about compliance. And that's kind of like brings me to actually the very first thing is like thinking about the tools that we use when we're working with kids, right? So the first thing before I even start an assessment is I think about what tools I might use. Um, and it's really important that we don't just give tests that we know a kid is going to absolutely bomb, right? If we go into it knowing like this is going to be really the WISC 5 is really language heavy and this kid has lower receptive language. They have a harder time understanding language. Okay, I'm not going to give that assessment then, right? So it's really important that a skilled provider wouldn't do that, but some people just get used to giving the same tools over and over again. Even thinking about our parents and the rating scales that we give, how are they going to view their child? And look, there really aren't strength-based or neurodiversity affirming rating scales. Um, but we can do our best to be selective about which ones we're going to be giving. And also making sure that we're not like overloading parents on rating scales, because when we have neurodivergent kids, a lot of times we have neurodivergent parents too. So we need to be thoughtful about the things that we're administering to parents also. And we also want to think about including the child's voice in the assessment. And sometimes that looks like a interview with the child. And that's something that I've always done. But student voice comes out a little different now for me. It might not be their literal voice or things that I've asked them and things they tell me. Sometimes it's things that I've observed from them. Maybe it's something that I've observed from them, in a session in a small group or out on the playground, how they're interacting. That is also student voice, how you're seeing what they're gravitating towards. You're seeing what they're interested in. That is student voice as well. So just making sure that we're incorporating multiple aspects of student voice so that the report feels like them is really important.
Is there any way that we can try to get training for our teams or suggest, to our special ed departments about training so we can start really getting best practices established, like in individual districts, so this can start spreading? Do you have any recommendations for parents on how we can do that?
Honestly, I think a really good way to do it is getting that into your child's IEP. Having a consultant written into your child's IEP, especially if it's one where a student is experiencing, a lot of dysregulation through their day and needing a lot of behavioral support as it's traditionally written, and that's something that doesn't jive with you. A neurodiversity affirming consultant might be really critical in your child's IEP. So that is something that you can definitely request. And there are some of us out there who do that kind of work. And then in terms of trainings, yeah, there are trainings out there too. A lot of webinars or things online, but it can be a little tricky to find them. It's still definitely a growing area. But there are people who do those types of trainings. I do those types of trainings for districts and at conferences. And I know other people in the community also do that. So there's definitely options out there if you're trying to get that information out. And also like coming from a place of curiosity, like just because, no one on your team on the IEP team has said they're neurodiversity affirming doesn't mean that none of them are. So even just coming from it, like are any of the practitioners practicing from a neurodiversity affirming lens? And finding out from there and then glomming onto that person being like, could we partner? Like, I'm really interested in, getting the rest of the team, or I love how you word that, or this goal, or something like that. So sometimes even just sourcing from teams that already exist is a really great opportunity. Um, and I am hopeful that districts are becoming more interested in that as well, about providing neurodiversity affirming assessments. I know the district that I work in is definitely wanting to move towards that direction, and there's a lot of flexibility for providers to do that as well. So, hopefully it's not just coming from parents, but I do have to say parents are going to have the biggest voice in the neurodiversity affirming change for districts, because
And students. I
And
would say
yes,
too, right?
and students, yes, but I think what we see a lot is the things like case law or big changes that come from special ed departments or even from like SELPA changes. Those really are pushed by parents who are out there advocating. And if parents come together and go to a special ed director, if there's a group of parents saying, we want this for our kids, that special ed director will listen. They will listen to the parents honestly before they listen to the psychologists that are doing it, right? So it's really important that parents have some good language, good background around it, and are able to advocate for their kids for neurodiversity affirming, not just assessments, but practices all around.
Could a family request an IEE for the specific reason that the assessment was not written in a neurodiversity affirming way?
A parent could request a neurodiversity affirming assessment. They could request an IEE for a neurodiversity affirming assessment if they feel like the assessment that had been completed by the school district didn't lead to an appropriate IEP, right? Or didn't have appropriate or accommodations to provide FAPE. So that's where a parent could advocate for that. Not saying that all, psychoed evals don't, but a neurodiversity affirming eval is much more likely to provide the recommendations needed to allow for FAPE in an IEP.
And you could always even one step, if you feel like, okay, this accurately reflects their challenges,
Yeah.
but you want to include more of what they can do and what motivates them, you could always go back and say, okay, I want that reflected in this as well, right? You can go back and ask them to add to that report so it really feels like it is a more holistic view, because if what they're saying is accurate, but you still don't like the presentation and you don't want that to be the introduction of your child to their team, then you could also go back and ask that it is written in a different way with a more strength-based approach.
Right. Or even like if it is super deficit based, it probably isn't talking about the things that support them, right? Support the child. So you could, at least say, I'm not seeing, I see the concern. I see how, you've clearly, they're clearly eligible for special education, right? You've made that very clear. They have lots of deficits. But what are the things that we're going to do to support them? I'd like to see more recommendations about what things, actually work for them, what things they're actually good at, so that we can make sure we have a holistic view of my child. So even just, something like that could at least help support the evaluation to be more affirming.
Really, we want this to touch every part of the IEP, every part of instruction, every part of the world.
Yes.
So, what we're talking about in this very specific lens, obviously, is part of a much larger movement that is really exciting. It's that has definitely taken different language, different over the years, right? This is not something new that advocates have been, not been fighting for forever and ever, and it's new language, but it feels like it's something that is being paid attention to in a different way, and that is a credit to all of the folks out there with disabilities that have that lived experience, who are really coming together to say, hello, this is part of normal, humanity, and we need to start, reframing the approach to disability. So it's hopefully an exciting time, but we need to get more and more people on board and understanding to make sure that, we're actively building, this new framework, in all the different systems.